I was still on the delivery table, legs shaking, sweat cooling on my neck, when my husband's phone lit up on the chair beside him and he didn't just glance at it. He answered it, walked straight out of the room, while I was crowning. The nurse looked at me like she wanted to say something and didn't. 12 minutes later, my son was born without his father in the room. Ronan Voss missed the actual moment his child entered the world because a phone call mattered more. And that wasn't even the worst thing he did that day. Not close. My name is Delia Marsh, and before I tell you what he said to me 2 hours later, holding a name tag that wasn't even the right blood type on his own child's bassinet, you need to understand something. This wasn't a man who never loved me. This was a man who loved me exactly as much as I was useful. And the day I stopped being useful was the day my son was born a girl. Wait, did I say son? I meant daughter. He was so sure it would be a boy, he'd already picked a name for the company. That should tell you everything about what kind of family I married into. 3 years earlier, Ronan Marsh, I'm Marsh, he's Voss, keep up, it matters later, walked into the auction house where I worked cataloging estate furniture and bought a chair he didn't need just to have a reason to ask my name twice. The Voss family owned Northgate Distilling, 4 generations of a whiskey brand older than the state it was bottled in. Old money doesn't announce itself. It just quietly assumes you'll notice. His mother, Imogen, never once raised her voice at me in 5 years. She didn't need to. Some people can insult you with the temperature of their tea. His father, Cutter Voss, had exactly one rule that ran the whole family like scripture. The name only survives if there's someone to give it to. I heard him say it at our engagement dinner and laughed because I thought it was a toast. It wasn't. It was a warning I didn't know how to translate yet. We married fast, 11 months. Ronan said he didn't want a big wedding, said he wanted it to be about us, not the company. I believed him. I believed a lot of things back then. Here's the first thing I should have caught and didn't. 2 years of trying for a baby, 2 losses that broke something in me neither of us talked about out loud, and every single time, Ronan's first question wasn't "How are you feeling?" It was, "Did the doctor say why?" Like grief needed a diagnosis before it earned sympathy. The second thing, a woman named Priya Kesh started appearing in his calendar more than his assistant should. Northgate's newest master blender. Sharp, quiet, exactly the kind of competent that makes wives develop a sixth sense they can't prove anything with. I asked him once casually over dinner if there was anything I should know. He didn't even look up from his glass. "Don't start," he said. "Not there's nothing to know. Just don't start." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me, because it wasn't a denial. It was a request for permission to keep doing something. I let it go. I always let it go. That's not weakness, by the way. That's what it looks like when you're trying to build a family with someone and you've convinced yourself doubt is a betrayal of its own. The pregnancy that stuck happened in my 3rd year of marriage. Ronan cried at the 20-week scan. Actually cried, and I clung to that memory so hard afterward it nearly cracked from how tightly I held it. What I didn't know, standing in that ultrasound room believing I'd finally caught the good version of him for good, was that Priya was 9 weeks further along than me. 9 weeks. She'd been pregnant before I even conceived. Here's the part that still catches in my throat. My great-aunt Wren, a commercial lender who financed half the distilleries in 3 counties before she retired, called me the week I found out I was pregnant. Not to congratulate me, to ask if Cutter Voss had ever mentioned a note she still held on Northgate's original barrel house, a private loan from decades back that the company never fully closed out, buried in paperwork nobody bothered updating once the business got big enough to forget where its money once came from. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. She said, "Good, keep it that way until you need it." Then she hung up like she'd just told me the weather. I didn't think about that phone call again for 11 months. Not once. Not even the day everything fell apart. My son, my daughter Junie War, was born on a Thursday morning in March. Ronan came back into the room 40 minutes after missing the birth, freshly showered, smelling like he'd stopped somewhere on the way, and looked at her in my arms the way you'd look at paperwork that came back with the wrong signature. I asked him to hold her. He said he needed to make a call first. 2 hours passed. Real hours. The kind where the nurses change shifts, and the light through the window goes from gray to gold. When he finally came back, he was wearing a different shirt than the one he'd left in. Northgate only passes to a blood heir who carries the name forward through a son, he said, like he was reading terms off a label. Priya had a boy 4 months ago. Cutter already knows. I have to think about the company. I want to tell you I threw something. I didn't. I looked down at Junie, barely 6 hours old, and I said the only thing that felt true in that moment. You're going to regret timing this the way you did. He laughed. Actually laughed the way you laugh at something you've already decided doesn't matter, and walked out to take another call. He had no idea I'd just decided something too. My sister Odile got there before sunrise the next morning, still in yesterday's clothes, and didn't ask if I was okay. She asked what I needed, took Junie so I could sleep in real hours instead of stolen ones, and told me, quietly, over the worst hospital coffee either of us has ever tasted, that she'd never trusted how careful Ronan always was about being kind in front of other people. I hadn't heard her the first time she'd said that, 4 years ago, at our engagement dinner. Second night in that hospital, I finally called Great Aunt Wren's estate attorney back, a call I'd been ignoring for 3 weeks because grief admin felt smaller than growing a person inside me. Her name was Farah Ostroff, and she didn't waste time on sympathy. That note your aunt mentioned, she said, it's still active, and it has a clause nobody at Northgate remembers exists. A default trigger if any signing officer misrepresents their personal financial obligations to secure refinancing. She paused. Ronan signed new refinancing paperwork 4 months ago, describing his household as stable, with one dependent on the way. He didn't mention a second child born to an employee 3 months prior. That's not just messy, that's fraud on paper, backed by your family's money. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after that, because suddenly I understood exactly what Wren meant all those months ago, telling me to keep something quiet until I needed it. I didn't rush. I went home first, to a house that suddenly felt like a museum exhibit of a marriage that had already ended without telling me. Ronan didn't come home either. He stayed at his parents' estate and texted once. Hope we can be adults about this. As though adulthood was something he'd only just remembered existed, now that it might cost him. By the end of that week, Farah and I had gone through everything in daylight, with real coffee. What Wren's note gave me wasn't ownership of Northgate. It was the power to call the loan due, in full, immediately. Collapsing the exact refinancing round the company was mid-negotiation on, unless the board addressed the fraud on the paperwork themselves publicly before their lenders found out some other way. I filed the notice through Farah. 2 weeks later, Priya called me. I almost didn't answer. She sounded exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the newborn, told me she'd grown up with nothing, that Ronan had made her feel chosen for the first time in her life, that he'd told her, promised her, he was already planning to leave before I ever got pregnant. He tells everyone exactly enough to keep them moving toward him, she said. I just didn't figure that out until I already had a son with his name on the birth certificate and no ring on my finger. Here's the twist I never saw coming, and neither did Ronan. Priya wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because she'd been recording their calls for months, quietly, out of her own instinct for self-preservation. And she had Ronan on tape 4 months before Junie was even born, saying he'd already decided to deny any daughter I had because a girl doesn't solve the problem. She sent me the file that night, not for revenge. Because someone should get to hear it before he rewrites the story, she said, and hung up. The lenders' board meeting happened on a Tuesday, glass room, 14th floor. I wasn't required to be there. I went anyway, Junie asleep against my chest, because I wanted Ronan to see exactly who was sitting across the table when his father asked him, in front of 6 board members, whether he'd falsified stability disclosures to secure refinancing while maintaining 2 households. Cutter didn't defend him. Cutter asked if it was true he'd left his own newborn in a hospital room in front of nursing staff. Ronan didn't have a sentence ready for that. For the first time in 5 years, I watched him run out of script. Then Farah played 11 seconds of Priya's recording. A girl doesn't solve the problem. 6 board members. Total silence. Priya stood up, straightened her jacket, and said the only thing I ever heard her say to him directly, "You should have just told the truth to somebody, once, before it cost this much." Then she walked out, and I finally understood. We'd both been given the same performance, staged for two audiences who each thought they were the only one watching. The refinancing collapsed within the month. Not because I wanted revenge, but because the fraud was real, and once it was named out loud, nobody with real money left in the room could pretend otherwise. What followed wasn't clean. It took 4 months of mediation, depositions, and Cutter's own lawyers arguing the loan's original language shouldn't apply anymore. Decades old, they said, practically ceremonial. Farah argued it had never been dissolved, only forgotten, and forgotten isn't the same as gone. In the end, the company settled everything through negotiation rather than let it reach open court. Full repayment plus penalty, a formal correction to every lender disclosure, and, separately through the divorce, full custody, with Ronan's visitation left entirely up to him to schedule. He used 2 of his first 6 visits. By Junie's first birthday, he'd stopped scheduling them altogether. No clause, no settlement, and no amount of money ever fixed the part of him that made that choice the day she was born. Cutter reached out 8 months later. No lawyers, just coffee. He told me his own father ran the family the exact same way. Usefulness over character. And he'd spent 40 years repeating it without questioning where it actually got any of them, until he watched his son walk out of a hospital room instead of toward his daughter, and recognized the shape of his own coldness looking back at him. It wasn't an apology. It was closer to a very late explanation for a silence he'd helped build. I live 2 hours from that family now, in a house with a garden Junie insists on naming every season. Odile drives up most Sundays and still hasn't let me forget she called it years before I was ready to hear it. Farah handles the note's remaining paperwork twice a year, always over coffee, always with the same joke about how 3 ignored voicemails turned into the only leverage that ever mattered. Junie is walking now, fast, reckless, certain the whole world exists specifically for her to explore. She started asking, the way toddlers ask anything, where her father is. I haven't found the right words yet. I don't think there's a version of the truth that fits neatly into a 2-year-old's vocabulary. So for now I tell her he's far away, and I let that be enough, because there's a harder conversation waiting somewhere down the road, and I refuse to have it before she's ready. I think about those 2 hours in that hospital room more than I probably should. Not the cruelty of it, the half-second right before I told him he'd regret the timing. The moment I could have fallen apart instead, and didn't. I don't know exactly where that steadiness came from. Maybe it was Ren, waiting decades in old paperwork for a moment she never lived to see. Maybe it was Odile showing up before sunrise instead of the man who should have. Maybe it's just what happens when you finally run out of reasons to shrink yourself for someone who was never going to notice the effort. Every night before Junie falls asleep, I tell her the same thing. The people who are supposed to choose you sometimes don't, and that's not where the story ends. It's just where you find out who actually does. So tell me, if you were the one still bleeding in that hospital bed, watching a man decide you weren't worth 2 hours of his attention, would you have stayed calm the way I did, or would you have let him watch you break? I still think about which one of us actually would have walked away stronger.